Before the famous World War II corvettes, there was another flower class built in the previous World War, although some of the features may seem familiar. With the outbreak of World War I came the first in a series of war emergency programs, which called for the mass construction of various naval craft, mostly smaller ones such as destroyers and submarines. However, it was clear that the demands of the Royal Navy could not be entirely met by the naval yard's output alone. Luckily, there was a solution already halfway completed. Ever since the effectiveness of mines in the Russo-Japanese War had been demonstrated, the Royal Navy had been conducting extensive research into minesweeping. This had produced a handful of old torpedo gunboats and trawlers which were converted for such use, and plans to convert even more trawlers at the outbreak of a war. But this was not ideal. The numbers available were too low. Neither the torpedo gunboats or the trawlers had any real resistance to mines, and there were shortfalls in range and speed, respectively. In 1908, a recommendation had been made to build a purpose-designed minesweeper class of about 600 tons, with a shallow 10-foot draft to avoid mines set to destroy submarines or capital ships, a speed of around 16 knots, and decent seakeeping. Keeping things simple and inexpensive tied in well with operational requirements. A triple expansion engine could suffice as the high speeds of turbines weren't needed, although if they could make more than 16 knots that would be appreciated, but a single propeller would not only make the ship cheaper, but the central shaft would also minimise the risk of snagging mine anchor cables. A series of designs were drawn up, but other calls on funding meant that nothing was built, despite the issue being raised a number of times. With tensions rising at the start of 1914, the design was almost brought back again, but it was assumed that enough commercial vessels could be repurposed. When war came, it turned out that this assumption, which no one had actually bothered to check, was false. But it was clear that minesweepers would be needed, as almost every destroyer capable of steaming was bound for major fleet commitments, and the trawlers were mostly needed elsewhere as well. With many more roles for a small ship, including the developing field of anti-submarine warfare, now also being demanded, the pre-war designs were revised and modified to allow the ships to be built in yards with no experience in military-grade shipbuilding. This, and large old-school style boilers, pushed the size of the ships up and up until they displaced just over 1,200 tons. At 240 foot long, the 24 ships of the Acacia class were in theory capable of 17 knots if they ran their boilers, driving the single screw past 2,000 indicated horsepower, but in practice they tended to run a little bit under this, and so around 16 knots was more typical. There was, of course, no armour, generally, but they were equipped with mounting points for a pair of 12-pounder or 3-inch guns, and later a couple of 3-pounders for anti-aircraft work, although in practice this would also vary considerably. As the war went on, older 4 and 4.7-inch guns became available, and these were gradually adopted instead of the 12-pounders. Since they were larger than most destroyers at the time, they were fitted with towing equipment in addition to minesweeping gear, which was their primary role, since outside of the limited gun armament, there was as yet no way to deal with enemy submarines other than just ramming them, which any ship could do. In view of the likely contact with mines, the bow was given a widely spaced triple bottom to try and limit any flooding. The magazine was positioned above the waterline, quite far aft, and given 1.5 inches of armour, the only such protection found on the ship. Coal bunkers ran across and along the hull for even better subdivision, and the 2 masts were capable of rigging steadying sails to help keep the ship stable in rough seas and when it was at lower speeds where it might lose steerage. The ships were built with remarkable speed. Ordered at the end of 1914 and laid down at the start of 1915, they were all launched by late spring and in service by the summer. Follow-on groups with slight modifications would be ordered. The 12-strong Azalea class were ordered as the Acacias were launched and were all commissioning by the end of 1915, and then another 44 Arabis class were ordered in the summer of 1915, 36 for the Royal Navy and 8 for the Marine Nationale, entering service in late 1915 and early 1916. As the war went on and the need for anti-submarine escorts grew, coupled with the invention of the depth charge, The ships found themselves more and more assigned to convoy escort as opposed to minesweeping, but someone decided that the warship-like appearance of the sloops might scare off the poor sweet innocent U-boats, and the next 40 ships, the 12-strong Orbritia class, I think, I'm not a particularly good gardener, of 1916, and the 28-strong Anchusa class of 1917 were deliberately designed to look more like merchant ships to tempt the U-boats into attacking, which would then make them easier to destroy, or at least so the thinking went. 18 or 19 would be sunk during the war, mostly by an even mix of mines and U-boats, but with further larger sloops being built toward the end of the war and the general downsizing of the Navy after the Washington Naval Treaty, most of them would be sold off during the interwar period, either straight to scrap, to other navies, or into merchant service. This, in turn, meant a few more would be lost in non-military service in World War II, but 2 vessels survived until the end of the 20th century. Chrysanthemum was scrapped in 1995, but Saxifrage, Sassafrage maybe, was renamed President in 1922 and for decades was a fixture on the River Thames in London near St Paul's Cathedral. Unfortunately, she is now moored in Chatham and facing possible scrapping over unpaid docking fees. Her fate at the time of republication remains to be seen.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.